Hello and welcome to Vanguard Audiobooks, part of the Learning College here at VNN. My name is Alex Linder. I'm going to be your host, your guide, your teacher, your cicerone. Is that right? Through the exciting world of Part 1, Chapter 3, London 1790, in the way that E. Michael Jones of CultureWars.com guides us through the exploration of his thesis that modernity is rationalized sexual misbehavior, and we trace it in his masterpiece, Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control. As I say, this is the third chapter that we're doing. It's going to take us page 33 up to 42, so it's not all of that long of a chapter, but I'm sure there's lots of interesting material in here, and we'll cover that today. Again, he's E. Michael Jones. You can find him at Culture Wars. He is out of South Bend. He's an independent Catholic. I believe he used to be a professor. He used to work in the art world. He began his investigations into the Jewish question, as I understand it, in order to understand why he was stopped from participating in a conference or giving a lecture on opposing abortion at Notre Dame. So Jewish power is so great it can prevent a Catholic from speaking against abortion at Notre Dame. How did that come to be the case? And by going down that rat hole, he has produced thousands upon thousands of pages. He's produced a magazine for decades, Culture Wars. The best magazine that I know of in the U.S., although I don't agree with traditional Catholic doctrine. Nevertheless, he goes into the Jewish matter and provides extremely valuable material for anyone, white, conservative, or other, who truly seeks to understand what is happening, regardless of what he thinks about or the way in which he would use that information when he comes up with it. For example, when you find out of the incredible destruction that Jews are capable of, you might feel anywhere on a sliding scale from Jews are trying to genocide whites and should be counter-genocided themselves, or you might agree with Jones that the Catholic doctrine is we have to love them and bring them to Christ, convert them. And only a churl would note that they've been trying that for thousands of years and it's never worked. But I am that churl, and that is my note. Anyway, let's get started here. Part 1, Chapter 3, London, 1790. On November 4th, 1789... 1789, what do we think now? French Revolution, we're where we were last chapter, except we've moved over to London from Paris, from France, so not all that far of a trip across the English Channel, and we're going to deal with slightly different cast of characters, but they're going to be involved with the same theme and events. And we know that out of this milieu came Reflections on the French Revolution by Edmund Burke, whom a lot of people consider the father of modern conservatism. Now, I don't know that he gets touched on in this chapter. I don't think he does, but this is the important thing here is you have Newton coming up with the physics, the materialist idea of what's going on in the universe, and this comes to be called the Enlightenment, which is seen as something wholly different and opposed to Catholicism and traditional Catholic doctrine that's dominated Europe for the last 1,500 years. Now, for myself, I see it as another side of the coin. It's yet Catholicism is one false brotherhood of man universalism, and Enlightenment thinking is another. Anyhow, Jones is saying that this bad sex doctrine comes from this mechanical view that everything is material and the flux of atoms, and thus we are not responsible for what we do. So whatever we do is in a sense justified. We don't need to be moral. We don't need to take anyone else into account. And he believes that with this simple explanation he can explain essentially all of modernity. But we'll see. Anyway, so Part 1, Chapter 3, London, 1790. And as I always say, this is Jones's particular way. I don't know that any other historian uses it. Each of his chapters will be a certain person in a certain place at a certain time. So you get a little slice, like a bioptic slice. You ever see that? I forget the title of it, but it was like a human, and they had sliced him into, say 2,000 slices just vertically through him, so you could see each individual slice of his entire body sort of scanned, or maybe even it was literally sliced up. But Jones has kind of this way of looking at history. Anyway, so Part 1, Chapter 3, London, 1790. On November 4, 1789, the Reverend Richard Price, the noted dissenting divine, gave a sermon on the Revolution in France at the meeting house in Old Jewry to the Society for Commemorating the Revolution of 1688 in Great Britain. So that was the Glorious Revolution in Britain. "We are met," Price said in a sermon that was republished as a tract in early 1790, "we are met to thank God for that event in this country to which the name of the Revolution has been given, and for which, for more than a century, it has been usual for the friends of freedom, and more especially Protestant dissenters, to celebrate with expressions of joy and exultation." So he's celebrating the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. The reaction to the sermon was, as one might expect, various. Edmund Burke read the transcription of the talk in early 1790 and wrote in his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, in response, a document which appears on November 1st, 1790. November 1st, 1790, and was to become, according to Russell Kirk, the founding document of conservative political thought, modern conservative thought, political thought. Burke argued that Unitarianism was less a religion than it was a subversive political party, and felt that it should be suppressed. Burke argued that Unitarianism was less a religion than it was a subversive political party, and Unitarianism should be suppressed. And I have to say, I met some Unitarians when I went to college, so they are clearly feeding into that one world. They're vaguely Christian, but basically they're almost more Masonic, watered-down Christianity that always seems to go with leftist politics. And the founder of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke, felt they were more of a party, a subversive political party, and that they should be suppressed. As events in France proved Burke's predictions right, the idea of suppression eventually found fruit in the sedition trials of 1792, when Tom Paine, American revolutionary pamphleteer, fled to England to be with his fellow revolutionaries in France. Paine is usually considered the most French of the American revolutionaries in that he was less conservative and more of a radical. They simply wanted, saying, look, we need to split from England, we're over here, we need to make our own decisions, give us our heads, England, come on, we're Englishmen, we can handle it over here, just as you can handle it back in England. You need to let go, buddy. And but Tom Paine was more of a radical, and bring down the throne and altar everywhere, and his stuff tends to fit more into leftism, though he was beautifully expressive and articulate himself. Unlike Edmund Burke, William Godwin heard Dr. Price's sermon in person. William Godwin came from one of the many dissenting families in East Anglia, where he was ordained a minister in 1778. So this is William Godwin listening to Dr. Richard Price, Reverend Richard Price. Dr. Reverend, I guess it would be, or Reverend Dr. Price gives the sermon, and these other people are listening to him. One of them is William Godwin. They have their various reaction. One is Burke's reaction, and the other will be the leftist or Whig reaction from William Godwin. Godwin came from a dissenting family in East Anglia, where he was ordained a minister in 1778. Shortly after that, one of Godwin's colleagues, the Reverend Joseph Fawcett, Fawcett, gave him a strange and disconcerting book entitled Le Système de la Nature. We heard about that last chapter by Baron de Holbach, published in Holland to escape the censors, but written by a Frenchman by the name of Baron de Holbach, Holbach. As it would with so many 18th century thinkers, the system of nature, that's the English translation of Le Système de la Nature, but you probably would have guessed that, precipitated a crisis in Godwin's Calvinist faith. So Holbach's book is it's blowing people's minds and changing their views. from sane to insane is what Jones is going to argue. But the system of nature, Holbach's system of nature, precipitated a crisis in Godwin's Calvinist faith, which would be aggravated, made worse. That is a word. I'll pause here. Aggravated is normally used. Aggravated means to make something already bad or injured worse. It doesn't mean to create that injury. Stop aggravating me. That's wrong. At least in the way it's intended. It's not necessarily wrong. You could mean that if you were being clever or subtle, but no one would actually use that way. He was really aggravating me. That's not wrong. Aggravate to increase the gravity of something. So, one Reverend Fawcett is giving Godwin Holbach's system of nature, which destroys his belief in Calvinism. And then he's also reading Rousseau and Helvetius, and would only reach, says Jones, a resolution of sorts when he left the ministry in 1783, and then left the Christian faith completely in 1787. So it drives him all the way out of the priesthood. Godwin also read Priestley. Remember Joseph Priestley, the scientist. I remember a picture of a bell jar being associated with Priestley from studying biology. But unlike Priestley, did not settle for the halfway house to atheism known as Unitarianism. That's an interesting way to think of Unitarian. Halfway to atheism. Halfway house for atheism. Godwin embraced total skepticism and, after another equally unsuccessful stint as a teacher, embarked on a literary career which would last for another 50 years. So he went from reverend to teacher to writer. Godwin. William Godwin. And this is all happening right around when the U.S. had its revolution and then France had its revolution. In 1790, in the aftermath of Reverend Price's sermon, the world of Grub Street political journalism was alive with fantasies surrounding the revolution in France, particularly among the tribe of dissenters from East Anglia. That'd be the more Saxon part of England, the south east, more purely Saxon as opposed to more Celtic parts up north or to the Welsh side, the west. East Anglia means basically southeast England. So, after this apparently pretty famous sermon by Reverend Price, the world of Grub Street political journalism was alive with a fantasy surrounding the revolution in France, particularly among the tribe of dissenters from East Anglia, many of whom, like Godwin, were drifting out of the ministry and into secular occupations like writer and teacher. Again, this tracks with the increasing de-religiousization of Harvard, and these various schools that were founded by these ministers are becoming more secular. The big change at Harvard was in 1803 when they went to a much softer, more liberal version of the hard old style Puritanism, I think it was. So you have the general trend of these priests drifting into writing and teaching from overtly religious as reverends and preachers into more secular professions, but still with the same basic concern of teaching and leading and moralizing to people. Later in life, Wordsworth would give expression to the euphoria of the times in his famous couplet from the preface to the Excursion. Bliss it was that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times when reason seemed to most assert her rights, It's from Wordsworth. You'll see quoted, bliss it was that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. You'll see that quoted a fair amount in conservative stuff. O times when reason seemed to most to assert her rights. That line I've not seen, and I've not read that Excursion by Wordsworth. The events in France focused Godwin's attention in a way that would never happen again. He re-immersed himself in the Enlightenment books, which had caused him to lose his faith, and began attending meetings of radical societies. Eventually, all this intellectual ferment began to bear fruit. So, maybe some of the same intellectual forces and energy that were at work in France are starting to stir. They're not predominant or dominant in England, but there's some of that is starting to stir over across the channel in England. And that's what Burke and other men who could see they could see the horror of the French Revolution, where others saw only glory and the sanguinous, chopping off of heads, were worried that the same thing would happen in England, and because they could see the end result. They could see it was not a good thing, and they could see that it was a real danger to England. So they spoke and wrote against it, and it really drew out their eloquence. On May 17th, again, there's a typo. They left out the day, but someday in May 1791, so a year later, shortly after reading Tom Paine's recently published book, The Rights of Man, he confided to his diary that he had just conceived of a massive book which he would, quote, philosophically place the principles of politics on an immovable basis which would overbear and annihilate all oppositions, end quote. That's a lot of confidence, isn't it? In July of 1791, Godwin sold the idea to the radical publisher Joseph Johnson, and in September of 1791, he set to work on his revolutionary magnum opus, a task which would occupy him for the next 16 months. In Godwin's book, we find little more than the English language version of the same project that had motored the philosophes across the Channel, namely an application of Newton to the social order. Newton would be mechanical universe and gravity, and idea that the celestial bodies move in a sort of clockwork fixed patterns that are identifiable. And so they necessarily draw from that. They draw well, what if it's like that for human relations? Same way it is for celestial bodies. And that's a very exciting idea to them. They set out to write their books proving how that works, or explaining how it works. Application of Newton to the social order. What the philosophes are doing in France, and now what Godwin and others are starting to do in England. Application of Newton to the social order. This prime requirement for the project was a particularly vivid imagination, as the thinker tried to imagine all of human interaction as the outcome of the random bumping together of insensate atoms. The discovery of underlying principles that lay at the center of this project meant the devaluation of everything that man had previously held sacred. In particular, family ties and religion were to be eschewed in favor of an objectivity which Godwin at one point compared to an angel looking at earth from a great height. The erosion of morals followed so naturally from this presupposition that it is difficult not to see it, as Aldous Huxley did in his book Ends and Means a century and a half later, i.e. 50 plus years before Jones expounds on the same thesis, which he evidently, although he never says it overtly, got from Huxley. So, the erosion of morals followed naturally from this way of looking at things and seeing it as entirely mechanical. And if it's all preset and determined, then your morality doesn't matter, and that liberates people to do what they want to do that may not be such a good idea or may be destructive, is what Jones is saying. The erosion of morals followed so naturally from this presupposition that it is difficult not to see it, as Aldous Huxley did in his book Ends and Means. Aldous Huxley, Ends and Means, a century and a half later, or that'd be around 1940 or so, as part of the motivation for adopting the Enlightenment worldview from the beginning. This, in many ways, is precisely how both the left and the right saw Godwin's book. The conservatives criticized it because it eroded morals, and radicals like Percy Shelley, the Romantic Revolutionary, praised it for the same reason. So they both, kind of like they see blacks, one says we can fix it, the other says we need to protect against it. And these guys see this book the same way, like, oh, it's destroying morals, and they say, yeah, and that's why it's so good. The conservatives criticized it because it eroded morals, and radicals like Percy Shelley, the Romantic Revolutionary, praised it for eroding morals. Except for the values which Shelley attached to sexual liberation, his views are identical with those of the anti-Jacobin review. Now, the Jacobins, of course, are the radicals in France, the sans-culottes, the ones without pants, the the killers, the mob, the scum. So the anti-Jacobin review would be more toward the elite or toward the traditional. Quote, the promiscuous intercourse of the sexes was, according to the anti-revolutionary faction in 1797, when Godwin's star had waned considerably from its zenith 2 years earlier, one of the highest improvements to result from political justice. And they don't even necessarily mean physical intercourse. I would guess they do to some extent, but they just mean probably more. It's sort of proto-leftism, like today, like women and men. There's such a rush to make them that they're not really that different. I can be this or that, but I can be whatever I choose to be instead of being what I'm born to be, a man or a woman, and women can do anything men do, and removing all gaps. This is sort of a prototype of that mentality. And so they're praising the promiscuous intercourse of the sexes in so many words. And that came from the Anti-Jacobin Review. Except I'm a little confused here myself, because he says, well, okay, I see. He and Shelley and the Jacobin Review are seeing the same thing, but Shelley is praising it and the Jacobin Review is criticizing it. 2 months into the writing of that book, on November 13th, 1791, Godwin went to a dinner party given by his publisher. So he's hitting his zenith, he's saying, in 1795. He gets all these ideas in 1790, writes the stuff 1791, and then he's hits his heights a few years later. 2 months into the writing of the book, toward the end of 1791, Godwin went to a dinner party given by his publisher, at which he intended to discuss political issues with Tom Paine, the man whose book had inspired Godwin to begin writing 7 months before. Again, the American Tom Paine. Also attending the dinner party was a woman by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft. This is one of the big early feminists. You may recognize that name if you're familiar with feminism, who had recently become famous in London literary circles by writing a response to Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France called The Vindication of the Rights of Men. So she was a radical as well as a feminist. Godwin, who is also radical on her side, meets her. So left and right, there's a reaction to the French Revolution. That's what everyone's talking about. The French Revolution itself is based on science. Physical science in England in 1600s leads to political revolution in France in later 1700s, which leads to social changing of the social order and political revolution in France, and hints of the same throughout Europe, really, and throughout the world. The world has the shock waves from this and begins to consider these ideas, as well as looking at the actual manifestation, application of these ideas. See if it wants some of that. See if it wants to get you some of that French Revolution. Godwin considered vindication. That's Wollstonecraft's book in response to Burke's book. And Burke's book being the foundational document of modern conservatism, Reflections on the Revolution in France. That's something you have to read, and we will eventually get to that ourselves. But so one of the first named feminists, Mary Wollstonecraft, writes in response to Burke's book that founded conservatism. Her book is A Vindication of the Rights of Man, which is in the radical line. So she's on the same side as this Godwin fellow who's writing his book. Godwin considered Vindication, or Wollstonecraft's book, too polemical and felt that Wollstonecraft, flushed with newfound celebrity, monopolized the conversation at this dinner party he meets her at. Wollstonecraft, for her part, had reason to be garrulous. That's very talkative. Typical vocabulary word. Bourgeois AP English type thing. Having been raised in the same dissenting culture was Godwin. Again, that's a typo. This book is littered with typos. It's a real shame. Having been raised, it's not even a typo, it's the wrong word. Having been raised in the same dissenting culture as Godwin, she was now tasting the fame that he would savor a year later when the publication of Political Justice would make him famous, for a while at least. So, boom, all these these stars are bursting. They're going off. These radicals are making their name in England, coming up with their own version of what's going on in France with the philosophes. So it bids fair to repeat itself, and that's precisely what Burke and the anti-Jacobins and the traditionalists are worried about. Wollstonecraft, we're on page 35 here. Wollstonecraft, like the rest of the dissenting literati, the writers, that's a nice word to use for writers sometimes, people who think they're literary writers. Wollstonecraft, like the rest of them, the rest of the writers, the rest of the dissenting, the dissenting literati, had been moved by the recent events in France. Like Godwin, she was in the process of working out what she felt were the implications of the dissenting faith, and found that meant abandoning ever more theological baggage as the seas of thought got stormier. So again, in these larval leftists, you see the cooler than now problem that they have. They always got to be the cutting edge. They always got to hear about, even in non-political areas like bands. A band is good because I know about it and you don't. It doesn't matter about the quality of their actual melodies and lyrics and stagecraft. It matters that I know about them and you don't, making me cooler than you. And I don't say it obnoxiously. I just say it really subtly to just show you like you're not quite as cool and inside as I am. And this really is. It was one of the most confusing things when I went to school that leftists cared about that stuff so much. I just listened to pop radio. But it's a real big thing with leftism. And you see a little bit of that attitude here. They're all trying to get more radical and famous than the other, thinking they're hip and cool because they're thinking of something that no one's ever thought of before, when the wiser types are always longer seeing. The more masculine types are saying, yeah, there's nothing new under the tree, hun. It's been thought before. Within 24 hours of the human race existing in more than one person, it had already tried every possible physical combination of bodies and mental perversion. Okay? There's nothing new there that you can do with your body sexually that has not been done by someone else before. So that's why there's nothing sexual that pushes the boundaries or pushes the envelope or is edgy, as the left likes to say. It's all been done before, but that's also why the Jews portray it that way, because they're portraying destructive behavior as somehow cool and edgy. But it isn't. It just leads to the same place. The difficulty and the excellence would be in forming and maintaining a relationship with a woman enough to raise children and a family. That's not easy. It's actually as hard as climbing a mountain, as one woman put it. I mean, it's doable, but it's not easy. And the only permanent rebellion and revolution is excellence in your personal behavior. It's not going out and getting a tattoo or getting, a disc stuck in your ear or a barbell stuck in your tongue or through your eyebrow. It's, in this way, it's accepting a standard form as legitimate and demonstrating that you could understand and master that form. That's how it is with human sexuality. Now, some things there is room to stamp fresh tracks in the snow of experience in everyday life, but certain things there's no room there, and sex is one of them. So these people are going to discover that, is the tale that Jones is telling us, even though they think they're very, very smart. And they may be technically, but there's also the Forrest Gump definition that stupid is as stupid does, smart is as smart does. If you do dumb things, how smart are you? That gives everybody a chance to be smart, right? Not everyone can be pro-smart, but everybody can avoid doing dumb things simply by being careful. And even the meanest intelligence can usually make out that that's probably not a good idea, dude. So they're at this dinner party. Wollstonecraft's book has already hit and made a splash. She's getting famous. Godwin's a little pissed. He's not quite there, but he's almost there. He thinks she's talking too much and people ought to be listening to him. You know what the feminists would say about that. Anyway, Wollstonecraft, like the rest of the dissenting literati, had been moved by the recent events in France. Like Godwin, she was in the process of working out what she felt were the implications of the dissenting faith, and found that that meant jettisoning ever more theological baggage as the seas of thought got stormier. And that newfound fame was having an intoxicating effect on Mary Wollstonecraft as well. Theological radicalism was finding its expression in what one would have to term moral radicalism. Moral radicalism, as the descending circle around Wollstonecraft's publisher, Joseph Johnson, began applying the solvent of reason to accepted beliefs. Reason, in this instance, found its highest expression in Newtonian physics, and as a result, custom and morals, as passed on from one generation to another, became suspect. So they're looking at traditional morality in the light of reason and finding it wanting and changing their behavior and thereby destroying themselves, as we'll find. The suspicion becomes apparent in Wollstonecraft's response to Burke, who appeals to tradition as an antidote to what was happening in France at the time. Since Burke's defense of the Glorious Revolution amounts to a justification of a usurpation of the English throne from its rightful hereditary heir, Wollstonecraft is less than impressed with the traditions he purports to defend, saying, "Oh, so you're a traditionalist when it comes to our political revolution, but you're denying the same to France," which sounds about right, doesn't it? Sounds hypocritical. Let's read this again to appreciate the irony, okay? Since Burke's defense of the Glorious Revolution, that's the 1688 in England, amounts to a justification of a usurpation of the English throne from its rightful hereditary heir, Wollstonecraft is less than impressed with the traditions he purports to defend. If Burke, in other words, were really a supporter of tradition, how could he justify the Reformation? And if he didn't support the Reformation, did he want to return England to the time when, as Wollstonecraft put it, quote, "men worship bread as God"? If Burke is not defending tradition or inbred sentiments, to use her quoting Burke, I guess, in any straightforward sense, what then is he defending? Wollstonecraft's answer is security of property, in quotes, the true, quote, definition of English liberty, unquote, upon which, quote, selfish principle every nobler one is sacrificed. So she's a typical leftist. She thinks that property rights are a joke, and that it's the usual, I'm better than you because I'm willing to take money from people at gunpoint and give it to other people I think are more deserving of it. But she is right to some extent to mock him. Typical. This is the contradiction of all traditionalism. They praise tradition, particularly these new neo-reactionaries, or praise tradition with a capital T, very much like Barbara Bush talking about family. Well, how do you define family? Oh, it doesn't matter, whatever it is, whoever, bunch of people who love each other. Well, you can't really define it. It's the same with tradition. What tradition? Cannibalism was a tradition at one point. Is it good? If you can't look at traditions because they rationally, which is what the traditionalists essentially say. But I deny that there's anyone who doesn't do that. They all advocate no thinking for you, but thinking for them, because they don't think others are able to think. But if you think that people are basically incapable of everything, how can their traditions be that great? The traditions are just something, in my view, is that traditional, and I'm not really a traditionalist, is that tradition is the first thing that didn't kill someone, obviously. Since people, and I believe my belief is the only consistent one, people don't think that carefully. So it's not like what survives is some kind of great thing that was actually planned out. And I don't believe that they arose organically either. I believe they arose by one person coming up with something and then others copying him. And then maybe over time they added to it, but they probably were not the type of people who were capable of creating it by themselves in the first place. They're just following along. If most people are repeaters and not particularly sharp, how valuable can their traditions be? There's less to traditionalism than meets the eye. Anyhow, so she's rightly calling him out on some of his contradictions. Back to Jones now, as we're on 35 here, going up to 42 in this part. The debate over property and economics would intensify during the 19th century. The political debate took on the coloration of the revolutions in France and America, but underpinning it was a psychology that was based on traditional morals. Mary Wollstonecraft may have been a political and theological radical, but her morals and the psychology based on them were as traditional as Burke's. Her morals and psychology were traditional, just as traditional as Burke's, even though her politics were becoming radical and her theology was becoming radical. In fact, it was the fact that they shared the same psychology that allowed her to make her moral points in the debate. Instead of customs and, quote, inbred sentiments, unquote, which is Burke's, as our guide, instead of inbred sentiments and custom, Wollstonecraft proposes reason, which is the sign that we are, quote, are superior to brute creation, unquote, and a guide of passion as well. Cultivation of reason, she writes, is an arduous task, and men of lively fancy, finding it easier to follow the impulse of passion, endeavor to persuade themselves and others that it is the most natural. When the passions gain the upper hand over reason, that chaotic state of mind is known as madness, says Jones. When reason is gone, we know not where, the wild elements of passion clash, and all is horror and confusion. The traditional view, which is not just Catholic but Greek, is that the passions are horses that have to be led, have to be ridden and reined by men. Otherwise, they will ride the man, destroy him. As an encore to her success in attacking Burke, Wollstonecraft wrote the even more polemical Vindication of the Rights of Women, a feminist tract, the first of many to come, which earned her the ire of Horace Walpole, who christened her a, quote, hyena in petticoats. That's Walpole on Wollstonecraft for her efforts. The Rights of Women also earned Wollstonecraft the reputation as a dangerous radical, a reputation which was, in many ways, unearned, at least in terms of morals and psychology. So she writes something about the rights of man, then she writes Vindication of the Rights of Women. She wrote Vindication of the Rights of Men, and then she wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women, making her kind of the proto-feminist. So we see feminism and conservatism getting kind of formally founded around the same time, you could say, and both of them in reaction to the French Revolution, which is kind of the beginning of modernity along with the Enlightenment, going kind of from scientific naturalistic discoveries to the attempt to translate that into the social, political, moral order. But Jones is saying that Wollstonecraft was more traditional in the morals and psychology, despite her increasing liberalization and radicalization on the political front, which is an interesting point. As some indication of her frame of mind at the time, there is evidence in Mary, a Fiction, a novel she submitted to the publisher Joseph Johnson at around this time, in which the heroine leaves a romantic attraction unconsummated, as the object of her affection eventually dies. She consoles herself instead with the thought that there is to come that world, this is a quote, that world where there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage, unquote, and by commending to the reader the thought of William Paley, specifically his Principles of Moral and Political Philosophy, whose definition of virtue, the doing of good to mankind in obedience with the will of God for the sake of everlasting happiness, is congruent with the one found in the Baltimore Catechism. Catechism is the Catholic educational instruction for its members. In a letter to her sister Everina, Everina, Wollstonecraft, writing to her sister Everina, Wollstonecraft, Mary Wollstonecraft, much like the heroine of her eponymous fiction, Mary, named after her, eponymous means like named after her, decided that it was better to remain unmarried if one were planning on a life of intellectual work. I could not now, she wrote, resign intellectual pursuits for domestic comforts. So she's like kind of the prototype of this feminist career woman who values her career above all traditional feminine domestic occupations. And in fact, doesn't have just a career, but a genuinely intellectual career. Now, I wouldn't say she was unjustified if she's capable of producing genuinely high-level material, and she was, so it is justified, but it would be used to propose this as a model not just for the truly exceptional woman, but for the average woman, and that's what we see today in all this girl power stuff, and don't even think about having kids until you have your career set. Well, you're already going to be tired and old when that happens. This is traditional psychology with a vengeance, says Jones, but Mary Wollstonecraft was not hanging around with traditional people at the time, and over the course of her years as a polemicist for the French Revolution in England, we can see the company she keeps taking a gradual toll on her morals. So, perhaps because she's a woman and inherently more conservative and safety-focused than a man, she retains some of the conservative moral religious psychology even as she abandons it in the external world of politics. But Jones is saying over time the circle she surrounds herself with is exacting its toll on her, and it's starting to revolutionize her private behavior as well. Or if not revolutionize, at least have an effect on it that's negative. The fish, according to the French proverb, rots first at the head, and Wollstonecraft seems to perceive the danger in that her passions might, quote, pursue objects that the imagination enlarges till they become only a sublime idea that shrinks from the enquiry of sense and mocks the experimental philosophers who would confine this spiritual phlogiston in their material crucibles. A little hard to get from that. It's kind of abstract, but you get the idea of putting these radical ideas to the personal test in the vaginal crucible, if you're a woman. But perceiving the danger and avoiding it are two different things. Wollstonecraft was neither a moral nor a psychological radical. She proposed a traditional psychology in which reason held sway over unruly passion, as opposed to just do it, baby, whatever floats your boat, which would be a giving in to the passion. You see, in line with the Frankfurt School doctrine of advocating general looseness, particularly sexual looseness, as a way to destroy white society, but that's hidden, and they make it say, oh, go eat the sugar. Doesn't the sugar taste good? Oh, it's destroying your body. Well, don't worry about that. I won't tell you that. Just focus on how good it tastes. But Wollstone was neither a moral nor a psychological radical. She proposed a traditional psychology in which reason held sway over unruly passion in the well-governed soul. It was the patrimony of the classical Christian moral tradition, but it was being eroded from within by books from France, and from without by the company she chose to keep. So Jones as always believes that basically biography is history, is destiny. And he's saying that that's why he focuses so much on individuals and the choices they make to see how their ideas play out in their own lives. The circle which met in Joseph Johnson's shop and listened to Reverend Price's sermons looked upon the revolution in France as their triumph, because at this point in 1790 it seemed like the bloodless triumph of their principles, and in many respects it was. It was Voltaire who in many ways launched the Enlightenment in the third decade of that century by bringing English ideas back to France. Revolutionary France was the proof that the radical theories of the dissenters could be put into practice. So now it's coming back to France, but even some of these ideas originated in France, not just the Newtonian stuff, but even some of the overt social and political theorizing started in England, he's saying, in the early 1700s, and then went to France, and now is coming back, having actually fomented for the first time in the world a revolution based on these ideas, these radical ideas. Dissenters, it should be remembered, revolutionary France, we'll read again, was the proof that the radical theories of the dissenters could be put into practice. Dissenters, it should be remembered, accepted the Calvinist notion of innate and complete depravity, according to which human nature had been completely eclipsed by the fall. Man on his own could accomplish nothing good. There was no such thing as a post-lapsarian human nature, other than the bondage to sin. A lapse would be the fall. The post-lapsarian would be after the fall. The difference between the Calvinist dissenter and the Enlightenment philosophe was similar to what Perry Miller had to say about the difference between Jonathan Edwards and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Jonathan Edwards is the preacher, sinners in the hands of an angry God. That would be your pure Calvinism. Where Ralph Waldo Emerson would be more like trust in yourself, have faith in yourself, more transcendentalism and more selfism, as we've talked about in other broadcasts. The only thing that separated them was the idea of original sin, Edwards and Emerson. Since original sin had no boundary to its sway over human nature according to Calvinist/dissenting theology, the abandonment of that idea would have the opposite effect on human nature, allowing it to soar from depravity to apotheosis. That is the deification, in one quick motion. So if we ditch the notion of original sin, then we're not original sinners, we're original angels, and then we can soar and things will become better, is the theory. This one thing that both philosophes and dissenters shared was the disdain for the idea of a perduring and an eternally lasting or fixed human nature, enduring or through. Per means through lasting, through enduring human nature. So the philosophes in France and the dissenters in England from Calvinism had disdain for the idea of a perduring human nature. Once the dissenters got rid of the Calvinist interpretation of original sin, they immediately became utopians. Heaven on earth was now possible, whereas to the Calvinist, heaven is only possible in the afterworld, aka heaven. But if we get rid of the idea of original sin, and men aren't originally sinful, or they don't have even a divided nature, if you don't want to accept that it's sin in the absolute sense, then you can believe that heaven on earth is possible. And so once you believe that, you'll have people actually going out in the world and trying to set up actual utopian communities, or communes more typically. And Oneida in the U.S. or New Harmony is another one in the U.S. And this is just what people are trying to do. And this would be the utopian socialism, right? In the first part of the 1800s that preceded the scientific socialism that was the departure that Marx created, claiming that he knew how history unfolded by scientific laws. So that's the course from Newton. And these ideas changing from one view of human nature to the opposite view. Humans have no nature. There is no original sin. They are naturally good. They're not naturally bad. And seeing these ideas reflected in the individual lives and the political lives that they lead, the communities they try to create, or the effects on communities they didn't create but live in, and what effects they have. So, heaven on earth was now possible. This is clearly the message of Price's sermon, and that's where we came in this chapter. We're going to read a block quote now from Price's sermon. What an eventful period this is. I am thankful that I have lived to it. And I can almost say, Lord, now lettest thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation. I have lived to see a diffusion of knowledge, which has undermined the superstition and error. I have lived to see the rights of men better understood than ever, and nations panting for liberty, which seem to have lost the idea of it. I have lived to see 30 millions of people, indignant and resolute, spurning at slavery and demanding liberty with an irresistible voice. Their kind led in triumph, and an arbitrary monarch surrendering himself to his subjects. After sharing in the benefits of one revolution, I have been spared to be a witness to two other revolutions, both glorious, and now, methinks, I see the ardor of liberty catching and spreading, a general amendment beginning in human affairs, the dominion of kings changed for the dominion of laws, and dominion of priests giving way to the dominion of reason and conscience. So the brave new world is starting, thanks to these new ideas. Mary Wollstonecraft, says Jones, gradually adopted the euphoric tone of her day, and the euphoric is definitely the tone of that passage we just read. Mary Wollstonecraft gradually adopted the euphoric tone of the day. Talk of renunciation and of reward in heaven, where there was neither marrying nor giving in marriage, was replaced by the slowly growing conviction that any number of previously inconceivable arrangements might now be possible. If France could depose its king, did a man have to remain married to the same woman if he tired of her? The idea was broached by Thomas Holcroft, Holcroft, another member in the publisher Joseph Johnson circle, in a novel called Anna St. Ives. The idea of dumping your ugly old wife in Anna St. Ives by Thomas Holcroft, which Wollstonecraft reviewed when it appeared. The story described a radical heiress who spends a good deal of her time rationalizing her sexual appetites in conversations with her lover, who assures her that in the future marriage will cease to exist. It kind of seems like that, doesn't it, almost, with the people not called queers allowed to marry. Since sexual revolution is inextricably bound up with political revolution, it is not surprising that the revolution in France should stimulate the revolutionary-minded in England to think about rearranging their personal lives. Wordsworth got swept away by the same tide, taking a lover in France during the early days of the revolution, then fathering a child, then abandoning both the mother and child when the revolution turned in another, more violent direction. So that's Wordsworth. They celebrate these ideas, then they try them in their lives, and they wind up causing misery. It is hard to imagine, then, that the same currents would not affect someone as impressionable as Mary Wollstonecraft. And her letters to Joseph Johnson at the time indicate that no matter how much she believed that reason should still maintain its control over passion in theory, in practice she was having difficulty living up to what she believed. In many ways, Wollstonecraft was proving Burke right, just as the subsequent course of events in France would prove him right as well. Reason, unaided by tradition and the social customs, was proving a slim reed upon which to lay the burden of human desires. And Wollstonecraft made this clear in her letters as, one by one, the spiritual practices of her youth fell by the wayside to be replaced by utopian hopes and schemes which were largely pinned on what was happening in France. Wollstonecraft stopped going to church and she stopped talking about heaven, and yet in spite of that still longed for some assurance of an afterlife. Yet forced to, quote, live on conjectures, unquote, Wollstonecraft found that reason was increasingly incapable to resist the imperious demands of passion. It was at this point in her life that Wollstonecraft met the Swiss-born painter Henry Fuseli, Fuseli. Fuseli had been born Heinrich Fuseli, kind of like my middle name, Rudy, in a formation. Heinrich Fuseli in Zurich in 1741 and was 18 years her senior, and already married when she met him as part of the circle of freethinkers that were connected to Joseph Johnson's publishing firm. Fuseli's father had been a court painter, but he had been trained as a Zwinglian minister. Interesting. I went to Marburg when I studied abroad in Germany, and that's where I believe Zwingli and who was the guy? Calvin and Zwingli had a big debate there. No, it was a different Protestant who had a big debate with Zwingli. Anyway, I'll leave that aside. Fuseli, so she's fallen in love with this Swiss guy who was a his father was a court painter, but he had been trained as a Zwinglian minister. He would be an early Protestant, I think, minister. And like Godwin, remember in Switzerland they had all kinds of little cities and states, and southern Germany as well, and there were some were Protestant, some were Catholic. Some were like open cities, and some you could get killed for believing the wrong stuff. So they'd race around, to get safe. Fuseli had been born Heinrich Fuseli in Zurich in 1741 and was 18 years her senior, Wollstonecraft's senior, and already married when she met him as part of the circle of freethinkers that were connected to Joseph Johnson's publishing firm. So Joseph Johnson is publishing all these books from these radicals in England who were very intrigued by and excited by the French Revolution. Fuseli's father had been a court painter, but he had been trained as a Zwingli minister, Zwingli, Z-W-I-N-G-L-I, a Zwinglian minister. And like Godwin, who had been trained for another branch of the Protestant ministry, he gave up both the faith and the ministry when exposed to the ideas of the Enlightenment. Fuseli was an ardent admirer of things English, and when given the chance by a benefactor whom he met in Berlin, emigrated to England, where he gave up the field of literature, but not before translating Winckelmann, Winckelmann, and dedicated himself to painting under the tutorship of Joshua Reynolds, one of the top English painters. Success came in 1782 with the exhibition of his most famous painting, The Nightmare. And you've probably seen that, an enigmatic portrait of a sleeping woman with a demon squatting on her chest, and a dark horse peering at both through a parted curtain. And if you've seen that, you won't forget it. It's exactly the way he describes it. The painting would provide grist for the mills of political cartoonists in London for the next 50 years, allowing them to satirize political figures like C.J. Fox, the politician with Jacobin sympathies, that is, radical revolutionary sympathies, in the election of 1799, as well as William Pitt, Napoleon, and Lord Nelson, who is portrayed lifting up the woman's dress under the caption, "The Source of the Nile." As we move on to page 39. In his memoir of Mary Wollstonecraft, Godwin claims that she met Fuseli in June or July of 1788, a month or two after Fuseli married Sophia Rawlins. John Knowles, Fuseli's biographer, claims that Mary was swept away by Fuseli's talent for conversation, falling under the spell of his, quote, great power and fluency of words, a poetical imagination, and ready wit. Godwin goes out of his way to assure his readers that the relationship was purely platonic. However, the only source we have documenting their relationship is the quotations from her letters to Fuseli, which are quoted in the Knowles biography. Mary Shelley, Wollstonecraft's daughter, so basically the founder of feminism, her daughter created Frankenstein. So Wollstonecraft is a political radical in England, writes the vindication of men, the vindication of the rights of men, and the vindication of the rights of women is a radical, gives birth to Mary Shelley, who created Frankenstein. Interesting. So feminism and then Frankenstein. And the birth of conservatism. And radicalism, and they're all getting off on each other as being radicals and exciting ideas, and they're young, they're smart, they're good looking. There's going to be some sex involved. Mary Shelley, Wollstonecraft's daughter, bought the letters when they went on sale, and either she or her son destroyed them as a way of sanitizing the public memory of her mother in much the same way as she had collaborated in suppressing the truth about her husband's life. So Mary Shelley was trying to whitewash her own mother, the creator of feminism, Wollstonecraft, and her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet who was screwing around. Whether the relationship eventuated in sexual contact or not, it was certainly full of passion, much of which emanated from Miss Wollstonecraft, the passionate defender of revolutionary views who had just turned 30. Wollstonecraft wrote that, quote, I always catch something from the rich torrent of his conversation worth storing up in my memory to exercise my understanding. So he's selling his game to this intellectual chick, and she's picking up what he's putting down. She's digging it. And anyone knows that women who think that they're smart are some of the easiest women to... I'll just leave it there. While conceding that Mrs. Fuseli had the rights to his physical person, Wollstonecraft set about laying claim to his mind. The congeniality of their mutual sentiments, Wollstonecraft claimed, allowed her to hold a place of preeminence in Fuseli's heart, allowing her to, quote, unite herself with his mind, unquote. So see, the traditional morals were weighing them to the point where they acknowledge that their duty, but they don't really want to fulfill it, and they're trying to find little clever ways around it rather than just saying, look, I'm going to do this, it's dirty, we're going to enjoy it, and that's it. We'll take the consequences if they come. They're not to that point yet. They're not owning their cheating and their sexual illicitness. I'm trying to give you the flavor of how Jones would see it. I have a somewhat different view myself, but this is Jones's story, and we're examining what he's saying. And we'll point out any gaping flaws we see, or any things that he could be. Any dogs that don't bark is how I usually like to put it. Stuff that is crying out to be mentioned and goes completely deaf because the author doesn't bring it up. Intellectual. This is a basic with me. Intellectual honesty. If you are arguing a position, you need to take all comers. You should only adopt a position if it's the big man in the bar. If it's the strongest one out there and has proven itself and is right. And if you're afraid to take on other comers, then you have a defensiveness that at some point someone better than bigger and tougher than you is going to expose. Don't take on a position unless you can prove it's right. And if you can't prove it's right, and if no other position can prove it's right, then say overtly, this is what I think, but I don't know yet. This is why I think it, but I'm willing to listen to better evidence if you have it. Intellectual cleanliness, I call it, or just plain honesty. Eventually, this passion became so imperious, her love for this Fuseli, that Wollstonecraft could do little but act as its agent. Eventually, she went to Mrs. Fuseli and proposed becoming a member of their household. This is how weird things were back then. It really was a different kind of an age. Wollstonecraft must have known that the proposal was a bit out of the ordinary, even for those revolutionary times, and for those frequenting the revolutionary circle surrounding Johnson, but she made it anyway, informing Mrs. Fuseli that, quote, as I am above deceit, it is right to say that this proposal arises from the sincere affection that I have for your husband, for I feel that I cannot live without the satisfaction of seeing and conversing with him daily. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's how formal they were back then. And we have seen this in the other books of the Living Architecture. We're talking about Gustav Mahler and the way that the founder of Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, and I forget the woman's name, but Mahler's wife, Alma Mahler, was cheating with Gropius and also with other men, but they would still kind of talk in the same language, so that this style persisted from the 1790s. It was still evident in Vienna 20, 30, 40 years later. This was European culture as it was evolving. So imagine the chutzpah writing to this guy's wife and saying, "Yeah, I'm really digging your husband. I gotta move in with you. I just gotta. I simply cannot go with get my daily Fuseli fix. Guy's incredible. Love the way he talks." But Mrs. Fuseli was undoubtedly convinced of the sincerity of Mrs. Wollstonecraft's affection toward her husband, but probably not as convinced that the affection would remain on the purely platonic level. And so Mrs. Fuseli not only rejected the offer, but immediately banned Wollstonecraft from any further access to the Fuseli household, a move to which Fuseli quietly acquiesced. It's difficult, says Jones, to say at this point what Wollstonecraft found more humiliating, the Fuseli's rejection of her proposal, or the fact that her passions had so gained the upper hand in her life that she was foolish enough to propose the arrangement in the first place. Either way, she felt humiliated. She had been blinded by her own desires, so blinded that she had proposed a ménage à trois to the wife of the object of her desires. Quote, "I'm a mere animal," unquote, she wrote to Joseph Johnson after the bubble of passion burst upon contact with reality, and instinctive emotions too often silence the suggestions of reason. The German proverb says a hard dick has no conscience, and neither does a wet vagina, apparently. I should have said moist or damp. It's funny how people hate the word moist. I don't hate the word moist. To me, it makes describes a state. Nothing wrong with it. It's like people decide, in a politically correct age, people decide that they hate the most random things just to discharge that entirely normal and useful and necessary portion of our emotional anatomy. Oh, I hate ketchup. Oh, I hate Mars. I hate the word moist. I hate the word damp. You hate mayonnaise? You hate ketchup? You hate a condiment? I mean, apart from meaning just simply I don't like it, they go on and on about it like it's some kind of defining touchstone for their personality. And I really am convinced that's because the normal hatreds, like as for the niggers that kill people in the streets every day of the damn year, are not allowed. Anyway, so this very smart woman who's writing these very intelligent books is undone. Even in the smartest of us, the passion, the strength of our innate animal drives overcomes our reason. The reason is a rider, but the horse is much stronger than the rider. The rider is smarter and can control the horse, but the horse, never forget, needs control and is much stronger than the rider, called reason. Rather than step back and take stock of just where the zeitgeist was leading her, the spirit of the times. Zeit means times in German. Geist means spirit. Wollstonecraft, perhaps out of wounded pride, decided to give full rein to the horses of passion and follow the spirit of the age back to its source. She decided to go to Paris to witness the revolution there firsthand. Actually, she had planned to travel there earlier with both the Fuseli's and Joseph Johnson, the publisher, but now that traveling with the Fuseli's was out of the question, she decided to go alone to Paris. Godwin says that the single purpose she had in view being that of an endeavor to heal her distempered mind. Distemper, cats get distemper and it kills them. Distempered means her mind's driven out of its normal functional channels. That's what perversity means. Another term, it means perverse means turned out of its normal channels. And she's going there to recover her equanimity, her even-mindedness, her even keel, to get the rider back in control of the horse that's run off, as she's been so inflamed and excited by this particular fellow. If so, the cure would turn out to be worse than the disease, but as with the imprudent proposal to the Fuseli's, she couldn't see this at the time. Wollstonecraft did not terminate the lease on her lodgings in London and gave every indication that the stay in Paris would be for about 6 weeks. She would write a book about the revolution, and being an educator herself, she would advise the French on how to change their system of education and bring it more in line with the practice of the enlightened English. And he capitalized the E in enlightened. So she's going to bust over to Paris, recover herself sexually, write a book about the revolution, help them, advise them if she can, as a sort of a consultant from the enlightened English across the channel. Jones. What she failed to notice is that over the course of its first 3 years, the revolution in France had become something very different from the way it had started. What began in liberation, and liberated sex in particular, was finding its culmination in violence and death. The English revolutionaries never quite grasped what was happening in France, certainly not as perceptively as conservatives like Burke, who understand moral historical trajectories better than the radicals who are seeing it all new for the first time and think it's something genuinely different because they're feminine in their myopia and excessive enthusiasm. The English revolutionaries were forever trying to interpret the events in France as though through the lens of English morals, which had not decayed as drastically as they had in France during the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. And remember, we saw last chapter with de Sade that there was a lot of lubricity in French society, which de Sade led or certainly exacerbated or aggravated. There was a great taste for wild sex scenes in books, and the morals, the public had become very licentious, apparently. The overall moral cultural level was lower than in England, and this is what helped cause and helped make the revolution in the first place and made it worse when it did happen. These things are matters of degrees to some extent. Forever out of sync, the English radicals, and this is a typical of English liberalism and liberalism in the world, are thinking they understand something in a foreign country that they don't actually understand. And the way to avoid the problem of liberalism, to look at things from the point of view of the people over there. Look at Africa from the point of view of the Africans, and pay attention to what's going on over there. Don't assume that all people are the same as you, that all other cultures are the same. Try to understand it without biases going in, and just look and see what's there and collect all the facts before you start drawing fine judgments about it. It is important to judge, but it's also important not to judge too quickly. Make sure that you understand all the relevant stuff before that you have the basis for forming a judgment. Forever out of sync, the English radicals celebrated religious liberty when the French were celebrating sexual liberation, and then when the English radicals turned into sexual liberation, the French were involved in an orgy of sexually induced mayhem, symbolized by the sexual mutilation of the Princess de Lamballe. We heard about that last chapter. They cut off her tits and stabbed her in the abdomen and cut her head off, running around with heads on pikes. Citizens of the nascent republic took to expressing their idea of liberty by wrapping the still warm intestines of decapitated enemies of the state around their heads like a turban. I mean, that's like something out of Central Africa. Passions were indeed clouding reason in France, and Mary Wollstonecraft, who still admitted the theoretical possibility of such a thing happening, particularly in her own life, was incapable of seeing it happen to her political heroes. Still acting as if it were the euphoric summer of 1790, preceding the revolution of 1789, Wollstonecraft planned her journey to France in the fall of 1792, so she's coming in 3 years after the revolution, and the mentality, the spirit of the times has altered from the wild and sexually loose to the wild and viciously dangerous crazy killer mode. Wollstone planned her journey to France in the fall of 92 when events bespoke another spot in the trajectory. The passions inevitably followed from liberated sex to death. When William Roscoe, fellow radical and fellow member of the Johnson Circle, brought up the September massacres to Mary, she dismissed them as a momentary aberration in the progress of progress, with a capital P, comparing the revolutionaries to children who might cut themselves on sharp instruments because they weren't yet adept at handling them effectively. Quote from Mary Wollstonecraft. Let me beg you not to mix with the shallow herd who throw an odium on immutable principles because some of the mere instruments of the revolution were too sharp. Children of any growth will do mischief when they meddle with edged tools. She's basically saying in any revolution you're going to have to break some eggs to make an omelet. It is to be lamented that as yet the billows of public opinion are only to be moved forward by the strong wind, the squally gusts of passions. Well, that's easy to say when there's a stretch of water between you and the people who are slicing other people up and wearing their intestines on their head. It's very ISIS-like to be topical and contemporary. Passions, in other words, this is Jones again, was politically necessary to move the inert masses to revolution. Missing from her letter to Roscoe is any sense that these passions, once aroused, might get beyond the ability of reason to call them back. So the wind reaped the whirlwind. Equally absent was any sense that those out-of-control passions might cause harm. Rather than take her humiliating rejection at the hands of the Fuseli's as a warning, Wollstonecraft decided to loosen the reins on her own passions and gallop full tilt into a situation which she was misreading in the light of the English mores of her youth. She should have paid attention to the English saying, "Wogs begin at Calais." As offensive and bigoted as it might be, it might also be accurate. They may not be Wogs, but they're definitely not English. They're different. It behooves you to pay attention to them. Wollstonecraft, she's going over there on assumptions that aren't true, and that can actually lead her into great physical danger. And there's a lesson in that for all of us, of course. Understand what you're getting into. You do that by getting out of your own head and using your eyes and sense organs and your knowledge to read and look and observe and reflect and understand something in order best to figure out what's going on. Not having some a priori concept that you refuse to change until it's too late and you can't change because you're caught in it. Wollstonecraft was commissioned by Johnson, the publisher, to write a history of the French Revolution. It would prove to be one of her least satisfactory books. She made the unfortunate choice of beginning at the beginning, and so missed writing about the events which were unfolding before her eyes. But there were other reasons why she would be incapable of reading this text. She never adopted the revolutionary psychology of the Marquis de Sade, and so she couldn't simply become a cheerleader, something that was always easier to do at a distance anyway, because you can pretend what's going on isn't going on, and you can simply create the revolution in your own imagination without being deflected, distracted, or simply banged in the head with a 2x4 by the reality unfolding outside your window. But still, she never adopted the revolutionary psychology of the Marquis de Sade, so she couldn't simply become a cheerleader, something that was always easier to do at a distance anyway. She would soon know too much to say that the revolution, which was now entering its bloody stage, conformed to the Reverend Price's expectations of those followers, and those of his followers. So she knew it wasn't going off the way that they had thought back in England, but at the same time she couldn't repudiate her revolutionary ideals either and agree with Burke. Then she'd be humiliated mentally as well as she had been sexually with the Fuseli's. The result is an incoherent book that misses the point of what was happening. And we got one more paragraph to go, or ending 41 and on to 42. There were other more personal reasons for the failure as well. The classical moral tradition had always claimed that lust darkened the mind. In this regard, Wollstonecraft's motivation in going to France was hardly disinterested. I think that's an interesting use of the word. Disinterested means not having interests, versus interested means you have interests. Not about whether you find something interesting or not. Then you would be uninterested if you didn't care, and interested if you didn't care. Interested means you have some interest, like personal, sexual, financial, moral, whatever, intellectual, whatever it is. You have an interest, then you would be interested, in the sense of having interest. Having interest versus being interested, two different things. And if you don't, on the one, then you would be disinterested if you didn't have any interest, and you would be uninterested if you weren't interested. People often use those wrong, and it can be difficult to disentangle or remember the difference between those, but there is a difference there. So one's interest in something, like you might have an interest in a will, or an interest in a you might have a share. Think of it, interests is more of like a financial thing. It's not just that, but that's the way to keep it separate from interest, whether you're interested in the ordinary conventional, where I'm interested in this or I'm not interested in that. If you're not interested, you're uninterested. Whereas interest might be having an interest in a park or something. All right, so there are other more personal reasons for the failure as well. The classical moral tradition had always claimed that lust darkened the mind. In this regard, Wollstonecraft's motivation in going to France was hardly disinterested. That means she had interest there, and from what he said, we can infer that she had a boyfriend or potential lover there, or she wasn't just going there to write a book about it. Wollstonecraft's book deal with Johnson was done on the rebound from her embarrassing involvement with the Fuseli's, but it was also a thinly veiled pretext for sexual tourism. At Paris, indeed, she wrote, I might take a husband for the time being and get divorced when my truant heart longed again to nestle with old friends. So she really is, she's going to live her feminism. She's going to live her Jezebel, period. It's difficult to imagine a more glaring misreading of the situation in France. At the very moment in which sexual passion was turning into bloody mayhem, Wollstonecraft indicates that she can turn on sexual passion like a light switch, have her fling, and then come back unscathed. Experience would prove to be an expensive teacher, but Wollstonecraft seemed at the outset of her trip incapable of learning this lesson any way other than the hard way, and she'd already kind of learned it with the Fuseli's. It just hadn't impacted her body, only her soul and her mind and pride. Like the Marxist who went on pilgrimage to Moscow during the 1920s, the early 1920s, Wollstonecraft saw the revolution in France as a way to indulge her passion safely concealed from the gaze of English public opinion in the enabling company of other idealists who were there for precisely the same reason. So just as a serial killer or a pervert might go to a big wild city teeming with revolution to get their murder on or get their depraved sex on, she's going there to get her her affairs on, have some sex fun, maybe write a book, and the people with English morals back at home that she's rapidly abandoning won't really know what she's doing. That's her thinking, and this is so interesting a story. It will pick up again in the next chapter. He's not done with it, but that will conclude part 1, chapter 3. Was it London, 1790? The start of the story of Mary Wollstonecraft, and we will pick it up again. Anyway, I'm Alex Linder. I'm at the Linder Files on Twitter. I tweet about this kind of stuff. All of the material that we do is at vnnforum.com. All the audio books and commentary we do, all kinds of stuff I've written, all kinds of good, solid, sticky threads. If you wish further contextual information about what it is to be white and what it means to live in this world, and what we need to do to regain white sovereignty, it's all at vnnforum.com, where I and a lot of other intelligent people hold forth. And I want to thank you for being with me today, and I'll be with you again real soon.